Greetings and welcome to this trial run of the podcast I am tentatively calling Workshop Refugees. My name is Zebulon Husett, and let's get to it. I was inspired by today's poem of the day on the wonderful website poetryfoundation.org to finally take the leap and record a podcast. I've been thinking about it for a long time, just hadn't gotten around to it. However, since it's the poem of the day today, October 3rd, 2018, I wanted to have this done today. So this won't be the same as how I envision the normal podcast will go. So we'll call this episode 0.1. We'll just be talking about this one poem and end with a writing exercise based off of it. So have a doc file or a piece of paper handy. So the poem of the day today was called October by Don Thompson. It was originally in Plain Songs in 2010. October. I used to think the land had something to say to us. Back when wildflowers would come right up to your hand as if they were tame. Sooner or later, I thought, the wind would rise to make sense if I listened hard and took notes religiously. That was spring. Now, I'm not so sure. The cloudless sky has a flat effect, and the fields plowed down after harvest seem so expressionless, keeping their own counsel. This afternoon, nut tree leaves blow across them as if autumn had written us a long letter, changed its mind, and tore it into little scraps. So there are many reasons to like this poem. My favorites are the opening and closing images. I especially like the images conjured by the lines, when wildflowers would come right up to your hands as if they were tame. I can see this in a few different ways, but every time I reread the poem, I imagine the wildflowers nuzzling the narrator's hand like a dog lifting its head into the narrator's palm or petting itself with his hand. I'm not exactly sure why I see it like that, because on the page it reads more like forest creatures, like Bambi, or as wild animals really mirrors wildflowers. But that's one of those great things about reading in general, but poetry in specific, is the ambiguity allowed to the reader. So I'm holding on to that one. The final image of the torn up letter is great as well, with the tone of the second half of the poem especially, but I'll get into structure in just a second. It speaks to me of abandonment. For one, the literal abandoning of the leaves of the tree stopping sending nutrients to and casting off the leaves, but as well as the letter which is abandoned to the wind. But the idea sounds like an apology or an explanation that Autumn was writing but couldn't get right. Couldn't bring itself to send. It had to be important or the letter would just be crumpled and thrown away. The effort of actually tearing something into scraps shows that the contents were deemed important by the author. Listen to that last image again real quick. As if Autumn had written us a long letter, changed its mind, and tore it into little scraps. Just lovely. Sonically, there are a few great moments as well. There's a subtle mirroring in the assonance of the first opening stanza that I didn't really notice until reading it out loud a few times, but listen to the lines closely and I think you'll notice it. I used to think the land had something to say, would come right to your hand as if they were tame. They're separated by a line, but they both have two short A sounds followed by three syllables and then a long A sound. So it's a good little trick to keep in mind if you want to build subtle rhythms into your poems, is to have multisyllabic slant rhymes, basically, and having little patterns. They don't have to be consistent. They don't have to stick around the whole time. But having a couple of little things like that can really kind of give your poem a flow or a rhythm that will help the reader kind of stay engaged and read it with a little more enthusiasm. Maybe, I don't know. Just my thought there. But the sounds become more noticeably musical in the second half, when autumn is being described, or October, sorry, is being described in more dreary terms, which I really thought was kind of interesting. I like that. As the descriptions become bleaker, the sounds become more lush. In stanza 3, for example, the cloudless sky has a flat effect and the fields plowed down. I also really like the sound of across them as if autumn. You can, a lot of like mixing of the sounds and kind of the F's, the subtle assonance is really nice. But then also there's nut tree leaves and long letter. A lot of just similar sounds in close proximity. If you get too much, if you run them along a little too far or you overdo it, it can start to sound a little Dr. Seuss-y, a little too intentional, and it can pull the reader out. But by using a few and keeping them from getting too drawn out and too predictable, it really gives the poem a great texture. Another thing that you'll notice in this is that this is a landscape, and there aren't any people or animals if you don't count the narrator. But using imagery, the author is able to bring life to the landscape. As I mentioned, the wildflowers and like bringing the animals in. But another example would be how the plowed down fields are keeping their own counsel. I imagine this as a crowd of people like murmuring amongst themselves, kind of like hunkered down with their backs to anyone and everyone, like just not open, I guess, and it's like a more closed off sort of feel, and that puts the narrator on the outside of the thing that he was looking for, I guess. So this it's a lovely little nature poem. It isn't trying to change the face of poetry, and I would get so tired of poetry if every poem tried to do that. Sometimes you want to look at a pretty landscape. You want to enjoy the moment and ponder it a little more than just what's in front of your face. So it's a nice little nature poem. It presents a familiar trope of the seasons representing, youthful optimism, pessimism, spring, fall. It's not unique in that aspect. But what makes it unique are the images that the author brings to the poem. The concrete details, the way that you're able to see the trope as opposed to hear the trope, if that makes sense. You witness it happening through what he chooses to share. Had it been written less grounded in concrete actual things, I don't think it would be nearly as successful of a poem. It would be kind of a generic idea that we've probably read a few times, or a dozen times, or 1,000 times. But as it is, I very much enjoyed it. So the structure of the poem is pretty simple. It is 4 5-line stanzas or quintets. The first 2 stanzas describe the spring and, youthful optimism. The second 2 stanzas describe the fall and dour pessimism. Well, essentially. It's a little harsh, but that's essentially it, if you really want to break it down to, like, the smallest bits. But each stanza serves a function, and that's what we're going to use for this writing exercise. So, your writing exercise, should you choose to accept it, is the following. You will write a 4-stanza poem. Got it. 4 stanzas. Length, doesn't matter. Whatever. This one's 5 lines each, but you can have your stanzas be any length you want. The first stanza will present an opinion, belief, or idea that your narrator held in the somewhat distant past, when they were younger, basically. Again, optimism. Okay, so whatever you choose that to be, It can be something silly, it can be something profound, whatever. The second stanza will present the pursuit of that opinion, belief, or idea when they were still optimistic, still thought that this could be it, this is the thing, this is what I believe, whatever it is. It's described that, and be sure to use images. Come on, don't forget that. The third stanza is when the armor starts to show cracks. It's when doubts in the original opinion, belief, or idea have really started to manifest, and the narrator has serious concerns about it and can point out at least one, and not at least, it should be just one major flaw, something that is a big problem with the optimism of the first stanza specifically, but first two. And then the final stanza is your narrator's goodbye letter to that opinion, belief, or idea. It doesn't have to be like a complete abandonment of it, but it should abandon at least the purity of the optimism seen in the first stanza. The narrator shouldn't believe wholeheartedly that is the case anymore. There should be a major shift in opinion, even if they still think it's a good idea, or it's something they believe it should be, maybe, but not necessarily is. So be sure to use October as an example of how to use unique imagery and to ground your piece in reality. That will keep the reader with you. It'll allow them to envision what is happening, and as long as you use your language very well, they should be able to understand what that signifies. So good luck, good writing, and peace be the journey.